open us in prayer this morning? All right, good morning. Memorial Weekend. Hard to believe it's the end of May already. I've asked Gray if he would open us in prayer this morning before we begin our study.
Let's pray. Our loving, gracious Heavenly Father, we come before you now just so thankful for another Lord's Day that you bless us with. We thank you for this time that we have together now, and open our Bibles and dig into the book of Nehemiah as we continue to dig deeper into your word. And I pray that you would bond this morning and help him to remember everything that he's learned so far and be able to teach to us, Lord, so that we can go out and be better servants of your kingdom. Be with us now, and it's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Thank you. Okay, we began chapter 9, and actually I took a fair amount of time to read this prayer, poem, whatever you want to describe that, at the start of chapter 9, and we got as far as verse 35. Before we leave that completely, I want to just revisit it for briefly here. What we've got is a situation in verse 5. It says, "Then the Levites," and it names 8 individuals, said, "Arise, bless the Lord your God forever and ever." And then it goes into this 30-some verse, 38 verses having to do with, it almost looks like what would be a corporate confession and prayer, where these 8 individuals are likely leading the population in this expression, and it's entirely possible that these people had a memory of what this was, because this is familiar sort of language where they're beginning. They're in verse 6, "You alone made the heavens, the heavenly hosts, the earths, the seas, gave life." They go through and they extol the attributes of God. They give glory and honor to Him. They then recount the history of God and the nation all the way back to Abram. And, you chose Abram. You found his heart faithful. You fulfilled your promise. In verse 9, you saw and you heard the plight of them in Egypt. They're recognizing what God's attributes were, what His actions were with regard to the people. So just picking up on the thing, you performed signs and wonders. You divided the sea. So they're recognizing that which God has done, as well as who He is, His character, His nature. You hurled them into the depths. You led them. You came down to Mount Sinai. You spoke. You gave them laws, statutes, commandments. So you made known to them. You provided bread. You told them. And then in verse 16, we begin to see, how did the people respond in this situation? Acted arrogantly, became stubborn, refused to listen, did not remember, appointed a leader. And then we've got, once again, the attributes of God in verse 17. You're slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness, did not forsake them. In verse 19, your compassion, your great compassion, did not forsake them. In verse 20, you gave your good spirit, your manna, the water, you provided. So these are all the action things, as well as the character and nature of God. They're recognizing, they're recounting this history that was the history that they know. And then down again in verse 26, they became arrogant, they rebelled against you, they killed your prophets, they committed great blasphemies. This is the people, the manner in which they have acted in relationship with God in the course of this history that they're recounting here. Verse 28, they did evil again, and it goes through this cycle. Many times, this is once again what God's action was. Many times you rescued them, you admonished them. Once again, the people acted arrogantly and did not listen. Verse 30, you bore with them, admonished them by your spirit. Your great compassion, you did not make an end of them. For you are a gracious and compassionate God in verse 31. Now what we've got starting in verse 32 is the specific appeal of the people at this point in time. They're saying, now therefore, having said all of that, therefore our God is great, the mighty and the awesome God who keeps covenant and loving kindness. Do not let all the hardship seem insignificant to you, which has come upon us, our kings, our princes, our priests, our prophets, our fathers, and all our people from the days of the kings of Assyria. However, you are just in all that has come upon us. You have dealt faithfully, but we have acted wickedly. For our kings, our fathers, our leaders, our priests, our fathers have not kept your law or paid attention to your commandments, admonitions, which you admonished us, but they in their own kingdom, with great goodness which you have given them, with a broad and rich land which you have set before them, did not serve or turn from their evil deeds. That's where we left off last week. So now, here's our current condition. Behold, we are slaves today. They were slaves when they were in time in Egypt, but now they recognize that they're under the oppression of the Persian Empire. This is not a light load upon them. They are now back in the land, which is a tremendous blessing, because that which God had promised has been fulfilled. They're back in the land. The altar was rebuilt. The temple was rebuilt. The walls have been rebuilt, but still they're slaves. And as to the land which you gave to our fathers to eat of its fruit and its bounty, behold, we are slaves in it. Its abundant produce is for the kings whom you've set over us because of our sins. They also rule over our bodies, over our cattle as they please, so we are in great distress. They've already recounted the times where the nation was in great distress, and they appealed to God, and he responded with faithful, loving kindness. And now they're once again appealing to God and saying, we're in great distress. We're calling out to you at this point. Now, because of all this, we are making an agreement in writing, and on the sealed document are the names of our leaders, our Levites, and our priests. So, at the culmination of all that has transpired in the last 2 months, since Nehemiah came into the thing, they have rallied, they've built the wall, they've come together, they've studied the Torah, the Word, they've gathered together, and now they're making a written commitment from the Levites, the priests, and the leaders that we're going to do certain things. And so that's where we pick up chapter 10 in verse 1. Now, in the sealed document were the names of, I'm going to read one, Nehemiah. There's 22 named priests in there, where all these leaders in the priests, among the priests, have signed this written document that this is what we're going to do. We're going to abide by this. It next goes into verse 9, begins the Levites, and there's 17 Levites that are specifically named. We're going to follow after this document that we're creating, our commitment unto you, our God. And then it goes into the leaders in verse 14, and there's 44 of them, and I'm not going to even try to pronounce 44 names for you for time's sake, but also for my own sanity's sake. But that's the thing, is what you've got is this array of the total leadership of the people are basically saying, we're committing in writing to this document that we're creating. In verse 28 then, the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, and all those who'd separated themselves from the people of the land to the law of God, their wives, their sons, their daughters, all those who had knowledge and understanding are joining with their kinsmen and nobles and taking on themselves a curse and an oath. Okay? Have we heard curse and oath sometime before in this history of the nation of Israel? Yeah, well, what is it, Jan? The two mountains, curse and blessing. And basically they're once again reenacting their history in this situation where the people then, they're not necessarily signing the document, but they're reenacting this curse and blessing that they know from their history. They're tied to their history here. And so as to what they're going to do then, they've got some very specific things. They're going to, if we check this oath, in verse 29, they're going to walk according to the law, which was given. They're going to keep and to observe all the commandments of our God, his ordinances and his statutes. Those are the things they promise to do. And then they get into we're not going to do. Verse 30, give our daughters to the people of the land, or the daughters, give our daughters to the people of the land, or their daughters for our sons. As for the people of the land who bring the grain on the Sabbath to sell, we're not going to buy that from them on the Sabbath or any holy day, and we will forego. We're not going to reap the crops in the seventh year, and we're not going to exact of every the exaction of every debt. This usury that we were trapped in, that we were caught up in, this sin, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to forego that. At verse 32, we also placed ourselves under obligation to contribute every year 1/3 of a shekel to the service of the house. What we see following next is a commitment to what is going to be required for the maintenance and operation of the temple, and the worship structure that they're basically committing to here. The showbread, the continual grain offering, the continual burnt offering, the Sabbaths, the new moons, the appointed times, the holy things, for the sin offerings, to make atonement for Israel, and all the work of the house of God. So they're all making a commitment. We're going to do what's necessary in order for the temple to function, in order for our worship to happen, in order for the priests and the Levites to be provided for. We're even going to go to, in verse 34, we're going to take care of the supply of the wood. I'm sure all of you were wondering this morning, now, who made provisions for the wood for the sacrifices at the temple? But that's the reality of the situation. They're going into significant detail and committing themselves. We're going to do what's necessary in order for this to work, in order for us to be able to worship God in the manner in which he's prescribed. We're going to do everything that's necessary in order to make that happen. So verse 34, they're basically saying we're going to commit to the first fruits of the ground, of the trees, the firstborn of our sons and our cattle, the first dough, the first contributions, the fruit of every tree, the new wine, the new oil, at the chambers of the house of God. And so what you've got is, you've got these 42,000 people or so who have come back to the land, and they're going to basically commit. We're going to give a certain portion of all that we have, and we're going to bring it into Jerusalem, and we're going to bring it to the temple. Now, the reality of Solomon's temple, and even the temple that was rebuilt, was there were storage rooms. All this stuff that is being provided and brought forth in order for the temple to function, and for the Levites and the priests to have the support and the means that they need in order for them to live, and the singers and the gatekeepers, in order for them to have the provisions that they need, there needs to be some place for that to be stored. Well, there were storerooms built into the temple where these materials then were stored. They brought all this contributions in order for this whole system to work. It had to have a place to land. And so they're basically committing to bring those. And we find later some abuse of those storerooms of the temple. But that's the reality of what it is, that for this whole system to work, we've got to be able to provide for these people who are committed to the work of the Lord, to the work of the temple. And so they're basically under this curse and oath situation, basically are committing to do what's necessary in order for this to work. The tithe of the ground, it goes into some other situations there. Verse 39, the priests who are ministering there are the utensils of the sanctuary, the priests who are ministering, the gatekeepers, the singers. Thus, we will not neglect the house of our God. For this to work, we've got to make sure that we do our part as a people. We've got to make sure that we're committed to providing the wood that's necessary, providing all the means and the supplies, the oil, the first fruits, everything that's basically prescribed for us. We need to make sure that happens in order for this to function. This is the work of the temple. And in order to honor God, we're going to do this. So we've got these people now that seem to have a united spirit. They have accomplished an incredible building project in order to finish this wall. They've rallied together. They've studied the Word of God. They've committed themselves. They've begun again these rhythms of worship with living in tabernacles, living in booths. They've come together. They've made these written commitments and these oral commitments, and they're now moving forward. And so this is a time of great celebration. There's a challenge left for them, and that has to do with when we start chapter 11, the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem, but the rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 out of 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while 9/10 remained in other cities. And the people blessed all the men who volunteered to live in Jerusalem. So you had all these people coming back and living in their cities. The problem was Jerusalem was underpopulated. They still haven't restored all the housing and everything there, but what is necessary is for about 1/10 of the people to be living in Jerusalem. And so we've got 42,000 people that were identified as the ones that came back. And now we go into, in verse 3, these were the heads of the provinces who lived in Jerusalem, but in the cities of Judah, each lived on his own property in their city, and the Israelites, the priests, and the Levites, the temple servants, and the descendants of Solomon's servants, some of the sons of Judah and some of the sons of Benjamin lived in Jerusalem. For the sons of Judah, it begins a listing here of people. And these are challenging portions of Scripture, because you've got all these names that are not only hard to read, they're hard to pronounce, and they don't have a whole lot of meaning for us. Jan sort of suggested to me that what I do when I come across these is I kind of transpose some of these people to Gray, the son of Phil, and Jason, the son of Don, and Lee, the son of Will, and this kind of situation where now these names have significance to me because I know who they're talking about. For the people that are reading this is a part of their world. This is a part of their life. And these are significant names to them, so that when you have this listing of people, oh, I know that person. That was so-and-so's grandfather. That was this person. And so it's very dry for us to go through these, but the reality of the situation is that this was significant to the people that are first reading this. And when this document, that scroll came out, and these words are read, and they're reading those names, there's a significant impact for the people that are reading those. So as we go through the end of verse 6, it basically accounts for 468 able men. Now the sons of Abraham of Benjamin, the end of verse 8, there's 928 of them that basically have committed and come back from their cities to live in Jerusalem. From the priests, we've got the end of verse, or the middle of verse 12, 822 priests that are coming back. And the kinsmen of the heads of fathers' households, there's four. The middle of verse 13 is 242. The middle of verse 14 is 128, from the valiant warriors, the brothers. Verse 15, the Levites, there's 284. Verse 19, the gatekeepers, there's 172. So you've got them identifying that these are the ones that have made this commitment, that they're being honored because they have agreed, we're going to leave our home in the city, we're going to commit to live in Jerusalem, from our hometown. In verse 2, they blessed the people who volunteered to live in Jerusalem. So oddly enough, when you total up all those numbers, you end up with about 3,044 identified people that have agreed to leave their hometown to live in the thing. And so it's already identified that there's a certain number of leaders that are already living in Jerusalem. And so if you kind of think, maybe there was 1,000 of them, you're going to be at about 4,200 people living in Jerusalem and about 42,000 people that have come back out of the captivity. So it looks like about 10% of the people are now living in Jerusalem. And once again, in order for the temple to work, certain things had to be there and had to be made readily available for the people. In order for this city to function in the manner in which it was supposed to function, you had to have a certain population, certain people that are doing certain things within that territory. So it's kind of an interesting thing when you start looking at the numbers and things that, okay, they were very orderly about what it was they were doing in order to, once again, what primarily we see happening is the focus was building a wall, but more than building the wall, we're building a nation. We're building a national identity. We're building a spiritual community of unified people that are going to worship God in the manner in which He's prescribed. And we're reestablishing this nation in the land in order for, God's hand has been on His servants, and He's brought about this action. The enemies recognize that God's hand was on this. The people recognize that God's hand was on this, and now they're responding. They're committing to do what's necessary in order for this to work, both as a city and also as a temple and as a worship commitment. Verse 20, the rest of Israel, of the priests of the Levites, were in all the cities of Judah, each on his own inheritance, but the temple servants were living in Ophel. We don't really have to go into detail on that. We've got an overseer for the Levites. Verse 23, there was a commandment from the king concerning a firm regulation for the song leaders day to day. David had established these song leaders that were part of the worship structure, part of the temple, and basically there's an affirmation here that that's happened, but also apparently there's a king, the king's representative in all matters, the end of verse 25, concerning the people. So this king, I think they're referring to, has to be Artaxerxes. So Artaxerxes actually has somebody there that's, okay, you've committed yourself to that, but there's somebody who has an official authority on behalf of the king to make sure that this is going to be taking place. In verse 25, now as for the villages and their fields, some of the sons of Judah lived in once again, we're identifying where these people are living and out in the territories. And so for us, this is not significant. You know, they're living in Micanopy, and these other people are living over in Cedar Key, and some of them are up in Lake City, and there's a few over in Jacksonville, you know, so these people know what being communicated here as far as the territory and the range and all of that. We then have in a situation where this church has people from a lot of different areas that we can identify readily for. They're committed, they're coming, and they're participating, they're a part of our worship, and they're living on their land in this city, this location. So now, we get to verse 12. We have this week and next week to finish chapter 12. Sorry. We have this week and next week to finish the book of Nehemiah. So we're going to go at a pretty good clip in order to do this. There's some exciting things coming. So verse 12, now these are the priests and Levites who came up with Zerubbabel. Once again, we've got a listing of names that aren't necessarily significant to us. We're going to go on. I haven't detailed the numbers of these people, but again, this was important to the chronicler who wrote all this stuff down. It was important to the people who were reading this material. So we get to this verse 27 in chapter 12. Now at the dedication of the wall, they sought out the Levites from their places to bring them to Jerusalem so they might celebrate the dedication with gladness, with hymns of thanksgiving, and with songs to the accompaniment of cymbals, harps, and lyres. So the songs of the singers, the sons of the singers, were assembled from the district around Jerusalem and from villages of Netphalites, from Beth Gilgal, and from their fields in Geba and Asmarath, for the singers had built themselves villages around Jerusalem. So you've got the singers that are going to be committed, that are living in villages surrounding Jerusalem. They're readily available in order to come and participate in this. The priests and the Levites purified themselves. They purified the people. They went and they purified the gates and the walls. And so we're preparing ourselves for what's coming next, this celebration. Then I had, again, oftentimes Nehemiah in his discourse here uses the first person. And so there's a few occasions where we have a third person description of what's happening. But he said, once again, then I had the leaders of Judah come up to the top of the wall, and I appointed 2 great choirs. Okay, this wall that I've described is big enough for a lot of people to be able to climb up on the wall, and he's got 2 choirs. These professional singers, those ones that are part of this function of the temple, then he's got 2 choirs up there. They're assembled on the wall. The first proceeding to the right on the top of the wall toward the Refuge gate. Hosea and half the leaders of Judah follow them. So you've got the singers, and then you've got the leaders. Half the leaders are going to be proceeding to the right on the wall. And you've got sound and accompanied by cymbals, harps, and lyres, songs. Big deal. This is a huge celebration that's going on. Then he lists a number of people that are there. Some of the sons of the priests with trumpets, and Zechariah, the son, verse 37, at the fountain gate, they went directly up the steps of the city of David by the stairway of the wall above the house of David to the water gate to the east. The second choir proceeded to the left. And while I followed them, he's committed, he's gone with this second choir, half the people on the wall. above the tower of the furnaces in the broad wall, and above the gate of Ephraim, by the old gate, by the fish gate. So they're proceeding to the left. They're this song, instruments, cymbals, harps, the singing's going on, the song and the leaders are preceding half the leaders of the people. So not everybody in the people are on the wall, but the leaders are. And they're, in all likelihood, the people are gathered both inside Jerusalem and outside Jerusalem for the celebration. They're able to see and hear what's being proclaimed with this celebration on the wall. Then we've got a whole detail about the people that were involved. Verse 44, on that day, men were also appointed over the chamber of the stores, the contributions, the first fruit, the tithes, to gather into them from the fields, the city, the portions required by the law, the priests and the Levites, and rejoiced. So the day of the celebration, they're also finalizing the arrangements for how are we going to basically carry out that which everybody's committed to do. We've got the commitment of the people to support the temple, the worship that's necessary. We've got the people that have moved back and they've moved into the city. We're once again establishing a city that has viability as far as the population goes. And now we just need to finish our organization as far as who's going to take care of this stuff, who's going to administer to the storing of this, all this stuff that's been committed to be given to the temple. Verse 45, for they performed the worship of their God and the service of purification together with the singers and gatekeepers in accordance with the command of David and his son Solomon. For in the days of David and Asaph, Phil often speaks about Asaph, in the ancient times there were leaders of the singers, songs of praise, hymns of thanksgiving. So all Israel in the days of Zerubbabel, this is all the way back to that first group that came at the start of Ezra 100 years earlier, and Nehemiah gave portions due the singers and gatekeepers as each day required, and set apart the consecrated portions for the Levites, and the Levites set apart the consecrated portions for the son of Aaron's. So we've got our organization set up. Whew. That's been quite a long and protracted time frame. And it's almost as though God has accelerated here in the time of Nehemiah that which was being done. That first wave that came, it was a slow and faltering process. They got the altar built, and then they're stalled, and they can't do anything with the temple. And then they finally get the temple completed. And then it's 55 years before the Ezra comes with the Torah. And Ezra then begins to permeate the people with the Word of God. There he's teaching, he's organizing other leaders and training them up in the Word. And then when Nehemiah comes, there's this incredible push as far as not just physical activity, but what's being established as far as now this city can function. Now this nation can function. Now this temple can function. Now this people can be the people that God has wanted them to be, has desired them to be. And as we looked at last week, the joy of the Lord will be your strength, is what almost all the translations are going to say it. But the joy of the Lord is your refuge, your stronghold. That God has joy in his people. His posture toward his people is one, I want to bless you. I want you to be a shining light to the whole world. I want the world